All right.
Excuse me.
You know, one of the things that attracted me to Orthodoxy about 30 years ago was that it was grounded in something that was bigger than just my imagination. I was frankly pretty tired of trying to figure things out on my own. And it was not just grounded on something larger than me or greater than even a pastor or a priest. It was grounded in something that goes all the way back to the apostles. And that was very attractive, that you didn't have to figure things out on your own, that you had an apostolic base. And in the same way that there's an apostolic base for really the gospel, one thing that did surprise me about Orthodoxy was that every subject that came up, whether it was the Eucharist or baptism or even modern subjects, it seemed like everybody went and talked about Genesis. That was really surprising to me, that basically everything went back to Genesis in their modern day answer. And that's really what I want to talk about tonight, is that in the same way that the apostles serve as a foundation for the good news of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, that Genesis is really the first gospel of God. It's the good news of the Old Testament. And if that's true, if Genesis is really that important to the way that especially Orthodoxy views their theology, then it's very important that we know how to read it. And so all of Orthodox theology really flows out of the rivers that come out of Genesis. And even more importantly than knowing what's in the creation account of Genesis, even before we get to what does it say, it's very, very important to know how does it say it. And so tonight we're going to be looking at how do we read the Genesis account of creation. And of course, there are 7 points. So we're going to start with the handout and go through this together. The 7 points I want to make are really, again, about how we approach something that's written in Hebrew for a group of people that lived in the land of Canaan. So the first point is that the biblical account of creation is starkly different than other ancient creation stories. There are many creation stories throughout the world that are very ancient through many, many different religions. And while it is true that they share sometimes surprising similarity, the creation account in Genesis has some areas that are starkly different. And one of those differences is that the God in Genesis is a creator God, and he is above all other gods. He is not just a God, he is the God most high. He's most high above all other gods. The other thing that makes this God very different than other creation accounts is that this God is a good God. He's a stable God. He's not fickle, he's not manipulative, he's not human. And really, if you look at all the other creation accounts or any of other pagan gods, they're pretty tricky. They do a lot of manipulation, they're fickle, they're hard to figure out, and they're hard to get you on their side. And so the ancient world, especially in the pagan world, was very much about finding a God that would be a patron to you and your land and your tribe, but how to get them there was the tough part. A third thing that made the God of creation, we can call him Yahweh or Elohim, were the ancient words, the ancient names that they used. The other thing that made him very different was that this God was not confined to geography. In the ancient world, God was a geographic God. When you move to a different, it's kind of like NFL teams. If you grew up, Pittsburgh, if you grew up in Pittsburgh, you're cemented to the athletic gods there. And if you ever met somebody from Pittsburgh, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But if you move to Kansas, at first it's kind of tough to root for the Chiefs. But after a while, if you live here a while, you begin to wear their colors. You might even listen to their stories. And you might even watch their games. And ultimately, you might even become a Chiefs fan. Well, in the ancient world, not so differently. If you moved from one land to another land, you had to adopt that god, those colors, those cheers, their fans, and you really became a god of their geography. Well, one thing that made Yahweh very different is that he was not a God that was confined to geographic boundaries. He was a God that was universal. He was a pancrator. He was above all. Second point that we're going to go to is that the biblical account, while we believe it's divinely inspired, is still written by humans, and those humans are historical humans that lived in a particular time and a geographic place with their own culture. You know, the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, the Christian Bible, including the Old Testament, are not like the Quran, the Islamic Quran. They're not like the Book of Mormon, in the sense that they're not a divine finger that comes down and man just kind of translates it almost like he's in a trance or a zombie. The hand of God touches man, but it's still written by the hand of man. And so it is a cooperation. It is a divine cooperation. You could even call it an incarnation of the godly message that enters into the scriptures. And because of that, man still participates in that action, and that man or woman lives in a particular culture, in a particular time, and a particular place, and they write through a language. You know, English was not God's first language, which is probably pretty good because really English has a lot of deficits. And when we read God's message in English, it's not the same as reading it in Hebrew or reading it in Greek. It loses a lot. In fact, there's an old saying in translation that to translate a message destroys the message because you can't really capture its truest essence. So the scriptures were not originally written in English, they were written in Hebrew, and when that occurs, we can lose a lot. Because man participates in the writing of the scriptures, Orthodox would not say that it's infallible in the way that maybe a modern American evangelical Protestant might understand the word infallible. You can find texts and find all kinds of difficulties, even if you got all the oldest texts and laid them out together, they would not be the same. There would be errors that men make with glosses. That doesn't mean it changes its inspiration, but we don't have an original text that everyone can go back to. If someone said there's an original text that doesn't have mistakes, that may be true, but that's also imaginary because we don't have the original text. So when you bring together man writing in their language and in their culture with God's message, you have to read it through the hand of that God. Let me tell you what I mean. If we're going to read about Jesus and read about Paul, you have to read them through the mind and the land of Jewish people because they were both Jewish. If you're going to read Genesis, you have to read it through the mind and the land and the time of an ancient Hebrew people that were living in the land of Canaan, which was a pagan culture. So third point, ancient cultures sang their oral history in symbolic language. What does that mean? Well, the ancient world was much more symbolic than we are. And Orthodoxy is much more symbolic than Western variants of Christianity. So we hold on to the Jewishness and the Hebrewness, if there is such a word, of the Scriptures because we hold on to their symbol. But it's very important to understand that symbols are very different across cultures. So again, if you're reading the Scriptures in a English symbol, you might completely misunderstand. Quick illustration. Richard Nixon, when he was vice president, and this was during the time of the Cold War, and there was a lot of attention being given to Eastern Europe for obvious reasons. South America was feeling left out in our friendliness toward them, and so the United States, the president, sent the vice president, Richard Nixon, down to Brazil to kind of warm them up, let them know America still loves you, we still care about you, we still want to keep up friendly diplomatic negotiations. So he flies off the plane, first time that he's ever been to Brazil, first time that I think that a person of that rank had been to Brazil. And he gets off the plane, and immediately Richard Nixon does this. And he is saying, in American English, it's okay. Everything's okay. I promise you, it's okay. The only problem is, while this is the symbol for okay in English, this is the equivalent to the middle finger in Brazil. It was shocking. It was beyond shocking. It was insulting. Didn't exactly warm up the negotiations. The point I'm making is that while that may be very obvious to me, in fact, we even have emojis, this. So everyone assumes that we know what it means until you go to a different culture and you realize that your assumptions could be completely wrong. Well, those same things are true when we look at the words and the symbols in the Old Testament and specifically in Genesis. And you may not have ever thought about this, but a word is really only a symbol. It's not any different than this. And especially if you're reading it in the Hebrew, because in the ancient Hebrew, their letters and their words were very symbolic in the sense that they presented pictures. The other thing that's very important about the ancient world is that their symbols were connected with sound. So, in the ancient world, if you wanted to know about creation, they wouldn't have a handout. If we lived in that time right now, I would sing to you, or maybe I would give you a poem, because the way that history, their understanding of history, which was different than ours, is that they would transmit it through a song. And the reason why that's very important is because songs and poems help you remember more accurately than giving you a pronouncement. So we're going to play a quick game of Name That Tune just to bring that home. Some of you may or may not know Name That Tune. It was a popular show for many, many years, and they would play a couple of bars and they would name that tune. So if none of us rehearsed this. This is before a live studio audience. If I were to say to you, to finish my phrase, and I were to say, "My country 'tis of thee," you would say, right. If on the other hand, if I were to ask you to say the second line of the name of that song, most of you would not get it right. If I were to say, finish my phrase, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America." So even though we've never practiced this, even though you have no idea what I'm going to say, with the sameness, you have completed the rest of that because it has a cadence, it has a poetry, it has a song. If I were to say, "I believe in one God, the Father Almighty," we remember things in song and in poetry, and so did ancient people, in a way that you cannot remember by narrative, historical, scientific text. And so there was an oral history before there was a written history. And for the oral history to be remembered, it occurred in poetry and in song. And one sees this throughout all of the Psalms, which are music, and one finds this especially in the opening chapters of Genesis. And so the way that the ancient Hebrew people understood and remembered this was that it was cast in a song. This is also why we chant the Scriptures. The Scriptures were never meant to be read silently. Now, in English, we read them in our head when we open up our Bible and read the lectionary, but really, you lose something. In the ancient world, they would have been chanted or sung out loud for good reason, because the words are poetry, and the way that poetry works is it doesn't have one meaning. And in fact, the sound of the word, sometimes they do funny things, and sometimes they do amazing things by having the word mean something else, and we'll get to that here in just a second. Something else that you should know is that in Genesis, there were no chapters and there were no verses. There were no chapters and verses in the Bible until about the 13th century. So like if you were, if you went to a jousting tournament in the 13th century, there was nobody holding up John 3:16 because there wasn't a John 3:16. So how did one know where you were at in the Scriptures? And you knew it by you would start it off like, I believe in one God. And people could finish it because they had rehearsed knowing the Scriptures in poetry and song. All right, let's go to point number 4. Ancient cultures, like the Hebrew culture, often wrote poetically. And the one reason they did this was not only to remember it better, but it made it more complex. And in its complexity, it made it more beautiful. So growing up as an evangelical Christian, the question was, what does it mean? Tell me what it means. And there was a great deal of focus about getting it right and tell me what it means. And it was typically one thing. And then you fought over whether you were right or he was right or the other person was right. That's a very Western, Enlightenment, rational way of thinking. The brain really is not well designed for truth. It's designed for efficiency. And for the brain to use up less sugar, less glucose, it likes to go binary. Is it yes or is it no? Is it right or is it wrong? Is it thumbs up or is it thumbs down? Is it red or is it blue? The brain likes to make things easy because it's hard to do complexity. Well, we would not like to live in this time because poetry has multiple layers. So English was not God's first language. The Hebrew was meant to be poetic and it was meant to be complicated, but at the same time it was very, very poetic in the sense that it was concrete. And what I mean by concrete is that Hebrew words deal in physical things that you can touch, smell, and see, and typically things that would move. So for instance, in the English we use words like mercy, truth, grace, or sovereign. These are abstract, philosophical concepts. They don't have any meat to them. In the Hebrew world, they would use, like the word El, which means God, is drawn with a letter which is the head of an ox. So El means that he's God Almighty, but Almighty is an abstract word, so it really means that God is a massive ox. An ox is powerful. An ox is what you yoke everything else to. An ox is what plows the field. God is the great ox. And if your God is a bull, mine is the great ox. So you see that the way that Hebrew people spoke was related to their geography, related to something very physical and tangible, and something that could move. So a couple of things about poetry, especially Hebrew poetry. As I've mentioned before, physical images, not abstract concepts, images that move from here to there. They were oftentimes musical, as I've mentioned before, and as you all well know, the Psalms are all written with instrumental music. And it even says that at the beginning of a psalm. If you actually read the small letters up there at the top, it'll tell you that it's to instrumental music. That's also very poetic, is to have things that have music behind them. There's an ancient Jewish phrase that says, "A wise man hears one word, but understands two." And what that means is that in the ancient world, even though I might say the word light, and you might be thinking I'm thinking about the sun, that there's another image and another image and another image behind the light. Light means enlightenment, I know. Light means not darkness. Light means I can see, there's order, I know where I'm going, the path is now clear. That is a very poetic and a very Hebrew way of thinking. And then also there's mechanisms of poetry. And so poetry plays on words. And I'll give you some examples now going into the text of Genesis. When it says that the earth is created, the Hebrew word for earth is Adamah, A-D-A-M-A-H, Adamah. Now, from that dirt, ground, earth, God breathes in that Adamah, and once he breathes in it, what does he make? He makes Adam. So from Adamah, you get Adam, and then when Adam loses his breath, he goes back to Adamah. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Dirt to man, man back to dirt. Man breathed in with a soul of breath of God becomes a living man. Without the breath, he goes back to the dirt where the worms crawl in and crawl out. So this wordplay of Adam and Adamah, and actually Adam in that context doesn't even mean, it's not the person, it's not the male person Adam. Adam is referring to both male and female. It's not until after the fall that male and female become separated and take on unique separate names. Now with a capital A, Adam, and a capital E being Eve. So it's the fall that separates the unity of male and female. But when they are in the garden, they are both Adam. All right, I'll give you another word play. Actually, I'll go on to repetition. Another thing that poetry does, as does music, I'm sure you all have favorite songs that you like, and you kind of know the words, but then when it hits the chorus, everybody jumps in and the whole car is moving because everyone knows the chorus, right? That's the best part. And the reason why you know the chorus is because in a typical song, the chorus might be done 2 or 3 or 4 times. The same thing occurs in Genesis and in ancient poetry. In fact, and God said, "Let there be X," and there was X. And the evening and the morning were of the third day, and God said it was good. And you see that stanza, that repetition over and over and over again. That helps you remember it. It helps you like it. It helps sink in of what's happening. These are not meant to be scientific statements. They're meant to be music that you can sing along with and remember. Last but not least, another mechanism of poetry is metaphor. The metaphor in the Old Testament is like the icon of the New Testament. The metaphor is what allows you to see the unseeable, to feel the unfeelable. And again, in English, we lose these metaphors. A lot of people, when they translate, want to translate accurately, word for word. But when you do that, you really miss a lot. I'll give you one example. The word for creating really comes from a word for nest, and while that may not be apparent at the front, if you look like on evening vespers when we read from Psalm 104, and you get this idea of God riding in the wind. Does that strike any chords with anybody? Like Riders of the Storm, which was also a pretty nice song. Well, the ancient gods were thunder gods, and they were riders of the storm, and they rode in the clouds, and they were like a huge, great bird, like a huge, great eagle that would riding the storm out, in the clouds, and they were in charge of the thunder and in charge of the storm. Well, God becomes that and more. And so he is the great eagle. He is the eagle who has wings of the wind, whose chariot, whose throne is up in the heavens. And you miss all of this metaphor if you simply read it from the English. But God is like an eagle, and in fact, there's some places where he's not just like an eagle. Some places he's like a mother bird that is sheltering the young. And we see those symbols continue on. For instance, in the Roman legion, you see the eagle as a symbol of power and leadership. You see it as the double-headed eagle that goes through the Byzantine world. You see it in the United States. What is our symbol? American eagle. That doesn't come from nowhere. That comes from Rome, that comes from the Canaanite religion, even before Rome. So these metaphors are powerful and they're timeless, but we lose them if we don't go back and look at them. All right, let's move to ancient pagan Canaanite mythology. In the ancient world of Genesis, in the land of Canaan, which is where Abraham went to, you have to remember that even though Abraham had a covenant with God, that when he is told to go to a different land, what happens in the ancient world when you go to a different land? Well, that's true. If you move from Pittsburgh and you move to Kansas City and you're by Arrow Stadium, what are you expected to do? Cheer for the Chiefs. So when you move to Canaan and you're talking about a God that doesn't live in your ground, you're expected to cheer for the local gods because the gods protect that ground. If you want to protect that ground from storms and from floods and from famine, you better figure out which gods they are, and you better make them happy and make them your patron god.